So hello, everyone. I think all my slides are positive, so we'll lean into that direction a little bit. So I work for the Democracy Collaborative. I'm a senior research associate there. We're a small think tank that's based here in Washington, D.C., as well as Cleveland, Ohio. We've been around for about 20 years, and our sort of framework for our analysis and our work is community wealth building, which is really about just the arch of, if you look at the arch of history and how individual wealth building has occurred in the history of this country, we look at community wealth building, which is what are the assets and resources that are place-based in communities that can be leveraged to build wealth for the community, and addressing many of the issues that we've covered today, including racial and economic discrimination, exclusion, and things like that. We do this in a couple of different areas in our advisory work, where we work with university systems and hospital networks to sort of help coach them along in the process when they're curious about this work. We do it in our field building work, which involves working with communities directly. We have an arm of our organization that is called the Next System Project, which is thinking about the next political economic system to get us off capitalism. We're a very progressive think tank, I should note. And then we have our research workers, which I am part of, and that informs all of the work that we do. So when we sort of prepared for this panel, the real question people wanted to sort of know was what's going on out there in the world to address all of the dynamics that you guys have heard today. And that's been the sort of the specialty area that I focus in the last 2 years, particularly in housing, but in particularly community control of land and housing. Again, we're a very progressive organization, and so our interest is in shifting not only sort of dynamics so that folks can be able to live somewhere and sort of access rental properties, let's say, but also how do you shift ownership culture in this economy? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the American dream a little bit, because I think Phil mentioned it a little bit in terms of the history of policies that have shaped the way we all sort of understand and live in the world and what we understand economically. But there's also the cultural part of it that includes the idea of the American dream, which was a government-funded, sponsored thing, as we've covered over the last 2 panels, that continues to perpetuate in society today. And so some mechanisms I'm going to talk about, community control of land and housing. We'll talk about one in particular, but over the last couple of years, I've looked at 5 different strategies. Community land trusts, which are nonprofit organizations that steward homes for home ownership as well as rental properties, and doing so in a way that essentially recycles public subsidies and any other private funding that goes back into the housing that people actually own and rent from to build some equity into their property. Limited equity housing co-ops, which are most prolific in New York City. These are also democratically, I should also note that community land trusts are democratically governed and operated. Limited equity housing cooperatives are also democratically run nonprofit organizations, typically by the tenants who also own the buildings and structures that they live in. And they get some equity when they do resell. Resident-owned communities are a similar cooperatively held organization. They are mostly for manufactured housing. There are about 1,000 of those across the country in sort of suburban and rural communities. And then 2 strategies we focused on, land banks, which are municipal or government-owned agencies or entities that essentially help steward vacant land and other sort of stressed land, like foreclose upon land, and shift that back into the market. In some cases, are also shifted into community land trusts and other means. And then the last one is community benefit agreements, which are legal contracts that are negotiated between communities, a coalition of community groups, as well as a private developer. And I will actually just focus mostly on the community land trust. I wanted to lay out the 5 of these because mostly they are in a report that we're releasing pretty soon. And I'm going to I'll share my email in case you're curious about the report after this presentation. But I'll focus on the community land trust piece because in the time that we've been developing this report, we've actually engaged with a couple of folks from Arlington who are really interested in the community land trust model and how that can apply to Arlington. So what I've done is elevate a couple similar case studies that are around the country to sort of speak to the dynamics that are here in Arlington. And then first to say that, one, to address affordability and displacement crisis, communities are leaning into these strategies to figure out how they're doing. Just as much as I'm here today, there are communities all across the country. Someone mentioned East Washington, D.C., the southeast area. They're now at their 11th Street Bridge project, concerned with gentrification in that area. So D.C. is a very landlocked space. They're now exploring the development of a community land trust per demands that the community had in sort of engaging this process. Also, right after or surrounding the financial crisis in 2008, the government had something called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and that money, some of that money went into land banks as well as community land trusts around the country. And in Oakland, which is one of the examples I'll show you, they use some of that money to sort of start up a community land trust there. And the goal of a community land trust is to put housing into a entity that will be stewarding that housing permanently and keeping it permanently affordable over time. So just to, I wanted to show this map mostly because this is the mapping of active community land trusts around the country. And it just shows that the point I wanted to make was they're everywhere. So they're not just in high market or hot market cities that are thinking about adopting that are facing gentrification. They're also in suburban and rural communities because it's applicable in different environments. It's really about how you shape the tool and use it, and not so much about the dynamics in particular. You have to sort of make the tool fit your dynamics, and that's sort of what we saw in our research. So the first land trust I wanted to talk about was Oakland Community Land Trust, and that's the one that was established in 2009 amid the Great Recession. They got money from the local Oakland city, which was passed through the NSP project, to essentially try and rescue or stem the tide. I think it was something like 13,000 homes in Oakland were entering foreclosure during the crisis, and they wanted to create something that would help prevent or sort of address this problem, but also keep people in their homes. So they created a community land trust. They've now got 18 limited and zero equity properties into that land trust, and they also have a community orchard and a mixed-use community facility that just got put in last year. And when I say limited and zero equity, I want to clarify for folks in the room who may not know. Community land trusts, the way they work is that the nonprofit organization that is the sort of community land trust organization stewards all the property that is in that land trust in conjunction with the homeowners who buy into a property. So to make this really tangible, if there's a single family home, let's just use that one for now, and I'm interested in buying into a property, a land trust is established, it's part of the land trust properties, and I, as a homeowner, decide I'm okay with entering the community land trust because it's stewarding a portfolio of housing that is affordable for me compared to the market. And so as a homeowner, what I do is I work with the community land trust, see if I meet their eligibility requirements around income and things like that. I get a bank loan from a bank that is familiar with the community land trust products. The community land trust puts in a set amount of subsidy to help me bring the cost of the housing down so I can afford it. I live there for about 5-10 years or so. All the while I'm building equity, I'm investing in the property, I'm getting some housing and homeownership training from the community land trust organization, and eventually I'm going to want to move. This is something that if you're like a first-time home buyer, if you've been excluded from housing all over for generations, and this is sort of a step into the ladder of home ownership, essentially what this allows you to do is sort of have that experience and then maybe go out and move into the market and sell the house that you were living in that was part of the land trust back into the land trust, and then they sell that property to another generation of folks who need affordable housing. So that's how it works generally. And in terms of equity, the way that it works is that a community land trust will take 75% of the equity, and then the homeowner gets 25%. And that's the part where folks are like, oh my gosh, you lose all my equity. The way that it actually works out is you can actually be pretty, you build enough wealth to get yourself enough footing into the housing economy and homeownership market. Whereas if you're just renting, all of your money is just going into the trash. And if you're a federal program and all your money is just going to private developers or homeowners who are sort of doing the Section 8, then you're not building wealth for generations of folks who could have some means of getting into a ladder opportunity. So that's why this tool is something that is of interest across the country. And limited, I just described limited, zero equity. There are some cases where the nonprofit really just assumes it's either rental property or folks are not necessarily in position to sort of own and build equity, so they just sort of cover that area as well. I wanted to highlight the Oakland one in particular because it sort of reminded me, when I thought about Arlington, Oakland's situated right across from San Francisco in the Bay, and they're facing a lot of economic pressures, much like Arlington, though I feel like Arlington is perhaps a little bit more advanced in sort of the way things are working. In Oakland, folks are feeling the heat from all the folks moving into Oakland from San Francisco. And so I wanted to highlight that just one for the geographic context, but I also wanted to highlight it because as folks, if anyone in the room is sort of interested in this model and has had some familiarity with it, one of the nice things about, or neat things about this land trust was their shift from single family housing into multifamily residential properties where they're supporting and converting properties that folks have been renting in or facing displacement or eviction pressures. What they've done is actually work with those folks and educate them to be able to have an opportunity to buy those properties. I'm going to start moving a little quicker because I know we're over time. The Cooper Square Mutual Housing Association is one that is in New York. It's an association of 22 cooperatively held limited equity and zero equity housing cooperatives. So it's a cooperative model, which is what I described earlier, democratically owned and managed. The residents all own the buildings together. But the other thing about this is that recently, compared to their history, which goes back to the 1970s, they added a land trust component to make sure that in a cooperative, you actually have the opportunity to turn that limited equity housing cooperative into a market rate property if you have everyone come in. It's not built the way the St. Community Land Trust is. It's built in so that it solves an immediate problem. And so folks can live there for 15 years, pay off their mortgage, and then sell the whole building for market rates, and then you lose that whole entire stock. This highlights the benefit of a community land trust, which is what they did. They added an underlying CLT organization to the property to make sure that it actually remained affordable even permanently. And then they were recently identified as a grantee of New York State money that was received through settlement funds. So I'll talk a little bit in my next slide about sort of the streams of funding for land trusts. So let's just go there. So Affordable Housing Trust Fund prioritization. So the question here is, how do you get money to support these kinds of things? And the ways that we sort of recommend in our report, as well as the ways that I think folks are really leading into doing it, is Affordable Housing Trust Fund prioritization. I know that Arlington has an investment fund for affordable housing, and I'm highlighting DC here because they use, some of you probably know that DC has a law that has recently been changed and limited, where residents who are at risk of eviction because their owner was going to sell their property had the opportunity to purchase that building. So until about April, I want to say it was most all properties in DC with some exceptions, and there was also a loophole that allowed some folks to get through without having to go through the TOPA rights. But now it still applies, I believe, to multifamily residential properties. Before it was all properties, including single family, and as you can imagine, there are folks in DC who are sharing their rental homes or who are part of a cooperative building. And so when a private landlord or developer wants to sell their building because it's gentrifying DC, the residents actually have the right to say, and ability and some time basically to go and say, we want to buy the building. We've done the business of organizing and raising the funds to meet the requirements to buy the building. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Burlington, Vermont also requires all their trust fund dollars be spent on affordable housing. So this goes to a range of affordable housing strategies they have, but Burlington also is home to Champlain Community Trust, Housing Trust, which is a community land trust. It's the largest one in the country. And you know what's interesting about, as I mentioned about it, is Burlington, Vermont is not a very diverse place. It's Vermont. And just thinking about the mapping that I've seen in the last couple presentations and the dynamics here in Arlington, that's something that could be looked to see how that works out there and sort of considering what are the strengths and sort of weaknesses of that model and how it might apply to Arlington. Municipal bonding is on the rise. Oakland passed a pretty large bond, and this is through voters. If you can build the public support, if there's that support here in Arlington, you might be able to get something like a municipal bond to support infrastructure development as well as affordable housing funding. Oakland did that, and advocates in Texas are now pushing for a similar mechanism. Community benefit agreements with private developers and local anchors. Columbia University is notorious because they have a CBA that was $150 million. I believe 20 million of it went to affordable housing fund. 4 million specifically went to legal assistance for folks at risk of eviction. So that's something that if there's a major institution like Amazon or what have you that may be moving to Arlington, you might, as coalition of nonprofit organizations, come together as well as the city to sort of negotiate what benefits they're bringing and making sure they're tangible and measurable and that they're actually, seen through. And then Detroit voters also passed an ordinance So Detroit recently in 2016 election, they had a pretty nasty battle, but ultimately voters approved a community benefit ordinance, which is essentially laid the groundwork for many community benefit agreements, such that if a developer wants to come in, if it meets a certain public subsidy threshold, then they have to establish a community benefits agreement, which is the framework for specific benefits that have to be provided to that community. And then lastly, settle some bank lawsuits and win big, and perhaps use some of that money for affordable housing preservation from Wells Fargo or whomever else is screwing over everyone historically in the housing department. And so that's my presentation, and we have a report coming out on this, and then it's much more laid out and it's written. So if you would like to get it, I just put my email up here because we're still developing the communications framework for publicizing, but shoot me an email and I will email you back.
Thank you. Okay, unfortunately, I'm hearing that we do not have time for questions, but I know that there are cards that you can write on. There are places in the back where you can put questions. I want to thank all of our panelists who gave us some real concrete tools, strategies, initiatives, things that we can do here in our communities. So please join me in thanking them for the discussion.